The music had stopped, but the echo of her sobs lingered, soft and broken, beneath the chandeliers of Silver Hollow's old town hall. You could hear boots scuff against the wooden floor, whispers curling through the air like smoke. Outside, the wind dragged dust across the street, rattling the saloon doors, as if even the night itself felt uneasy. Clara Whitmore stood alone in the middle of that ballroom, lace trembling at her wrist, tears tracing the edge of her painted smile. The man she thought would ask for her hand had just given his heart to another right there. Under 1,000 staring eyes, no one moved, no one spoke, until a stranger stepped forward from the crowd, a tall man in a weathered hat, the kind of quiet you could trust. He didn't ask her why she cried, didn't offer pity. He just reached out a calloused hand and said, softly, "Miss Whitmore, dance with me." That night, beneath the oil lamps and the heavy scent of whiskey and hay, two lives brushed against each other, one breaking, one beginning. And from a single waltz, in the dim light of a harvest moon, a story started to breathe again, a story about pride, redemption, and the gentleness only the wounded can give. And if these old Western tales find a place in your heart, stay a while longer. Hit subscribe, and let's ride back into the past together. Under the silver light of a harvest moon, Silver Hollow looked almost tender. The wind moved slow that night, brushing through cottonwoods and carrying the faint scent of wheat and smoke. From the old town hall came the hum of a fiddle and the soft scuff of boots on wooden planks. Laughter spilled out the door like warm lamplight, steady, familiar, full of the season's joy. Inside, the chandeliers swung ever so slightly from the rhythm of the dance. Lace skirts turned, boots struck the floor, and voices rose in harmony with the fiddler's tune. Near the back, beside a table of cider and polished silver cups, a young woman adjusted the ribbon at her wrist. Her fingers trembled, just a little. The name Clara Whitmore carried weight in this town, daughter of Samuel Whitmore, owner of Raven Creek Ranch, the man whose cattle marked half the valley. Yet tonight, she wasn't the rancher's daughter. She was simply a girl waiting for a promise. Across the hall, Andrew Calloway smiled that easy, boyish smile of his, the kind that once made her heart lift like dust in sunlight. He'd written her a letter last week, said he had something to tell her at the harvest ball. She had spent the afternoon pressing her hair, polishing her boots, choosing the blue dress her mother once wore to her own engagement dance. Even now, the silk brushed against her knees like memory. The crowd parted as Andrew stepped onto the small wooden stage near the musicians. The fiddle quieted. His voice was strong, almost proud. "Friends," he said, "I've an announcement tonight." Clara felt her chest tighten, her breath catch behind her ribs. He reached for the hand of a woman beside him, a stranger with city grace, wearing pearls that caught the lamplight. "This is Miss Eleanor Finch," he continued, "and I've asked her to be my wife." The room broke into applause. The sound was thunder in her ears. She didn't clap. She couldn't. The cider in her glass trembled, and for a heartbeat, everything music, laughter, air stilled around her. She turned away before anyone saw the tears, but Silver Hollow was small, and whispers moved faster than wind. A few women exchanged glances. Someone lowered their eyes. She heard a chair scrape, a cough, the fiddler's uncertain shuffle, as if unsure whether to play again. Clara pressed her hand to her skirt, the fabric damp where her tears had fallen. She wished for the dark, for the quiet of the open fields where no one could see her pride unravel. Yet here she was, trapped under 1,000 watchful eyes, her father's name on every tongue, her heart cracked open in the very place she thought it might bloom. Then came a sound, boots crossing the floor, steady and unhurried. She lifted her eyes. A man stood a few paces away. Dust clung to his jacket, the kind worn by drifters and men who'd seen too many miles. His hat cast a shadow across his face, but his eyes, gray as riverstone, met hers without pity. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, like someone reading a memory he almost recognized. The crowd, sensing something they couldn't name, stepped aside. The music faded to nothing. All that remained was the hush between two strangers. He tipped his hat slightly, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and rough from trail dust. "Would you grant me the honor of this waltz?" The words hung there, soft, steady, cutting through the silence like a promise. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The world had taken so much from her in a breath pride, hope, maybe even trust. But in his eyes, there was no demand, no curiosity. Only quiet respect, the kind that didn't need to know her pain to understand it. She glanced toward Andrew, still laughing with his fiancée, oblivious. Then she looked back at the stranger. His hand remained extended, not insistent, just waiting like the desert, waiting for rain. Her pulse stuttered once. Then, slowly, she placed her gloved hand in his. The music started again, hesitant at first, then sure a waltz that had carried 100 couples before them. He led her onto the floor. The murmurs fell away. All she could hear was the scrape of boots, the rustle of skirts, and the faint beating of her own heart keeping time with his. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as if he feared she might shatter. They moved together, two strangers beneath the glow of oil lamps and the ghostly silver of the moon filtering through the tall windows. Around them, people watched, some with wonder, some with quiet shame for having looked away before. Clara didn't speak, neither did he. Yet in that silence, something shifted, something small, but steady. The ache in her chest softened, replaced by a warmth she didn't recognize. When the song ended, he released her hand with a gentle nod. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore," he said, "for the dance." She wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped back, turned, and disappeared into the crowd, leaving only the faint scent of leather and dust in his wake. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the dry grass beyond town. Clara stood alone for a while, her hand still tingling from his touch. The moon hung high, pale and unjudging, as if it too had seen the moment and chosen to keep its silence. Somewhere deep inside her, pride began to stitch itself back together, not as it was before, but stronger, quieter. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he came from or why he'd stepped forward. All she knew was that when no one else had met her eyes, he had. And though the night still smelled of heartbreak and dust, something in the air felt different, as if the wind itself had turned its face toward change. Morning drifted over Silver Hollow like a slow breath. The frost on the fences caught the first light, turning each rail to silver. Far out in the valley, the fields still smoked from last night's lanterns, and the air carried that sharp scent of horses, dew, and something beginning again. A man on a bay mare rode down the narrow road leading toward Raven Creek Ranch. His coat was dusted from travel, his hat pulled low. He didn't look back at the town he'd left, nor did he hurry. Some men rode with purpose. This one rode with quiet. Jonas Hale. That was the name he'd given when he stopped for coffee at the livery before dawn. No one asked where he came from, Folks in the West knew better than to ask questions of a man who kept his own company. By the time he reached the split gate of Raven Creek, the sun was climbing above the hills, washing the prairie in gold. He dismounted slow, brushed the dust off his sleeve, and walked up to the house. A few men were already at work, the sound of axes and horses breaking the stillness. Near the porch, Samuel Whitmore stood with a ledger in his hand, his gray hair catching the light. Jonas tipped his hat. Morning, sir. I heard you might be needing a hand." The rancher studied him for a while. There was something steady in Jonas's stance, shoulders straight, eyes calm, boots planted firm. "You've worked cattle before." "Yes, sir. Drove a herd out of Abilene last spring." "You drink only water when I'm working." The corner of Samuel's mouth lifted. "Just a bit." "Fair enough." "See Tom at the barn. He'll get you started." Jonas nodded once, the kind of nod that said thank you without the words. He led his horse toward the corral, the gravel crunching underfoot, inside the big house. Clara sat by the window, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her. The lace curtains swayed with the breeze. She'd barely slept. Every sound from the yard found its way to her, the hammering, the neighing, the low murmur of men at work. And somewhere in that mix, a voice she didn't yet know, but somehow remembered. She looked out just in time to see him leading his horse past the paddock, the sunlight falling across his shoulders. He didn't glance toward the house, didn't seem to notice her watching. There was a stillness to him that drew the eye without asking for it. A quiet strength, the kind forged by distance. Clara set her cup down. The porcelain clinked against the saucer. She wasn't ready for visitors, least of all from the ghosts of the night before. By noon, the air had warmed. Jonas worked alongside the hands, his movements unhurried but precise. He didn't talk much, just did what needed doing. When one of the young ranchers, Luke, strained with a stubborn gatepost, Jonas stepped in, drove it straight with a single, measured swing. Luke grinned, wiped his brow. "Guess you've done this before." Jonas only smiled, eyes shaded beneath his hat. Work filled the silence, and sometimes that's all a man needed. That evening, Samuel came down from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "You put in a full day," he said. "You'll stay in the bunkhouse, meals at 6. You'll find it's quiet here, and I aim to keep it that way." Jonas nodded. "Quiet suits me fine." When Samuel walked off, the last light of day stretched long across the corral. Jonas leaned on the fence, watching the horses shift in the dim, somewhere beyond the yard. A piano played from the main house, soft, halting notes of a waltz. He knew that tune. He'd heard it once beneath the chandeliers of the town hall, when a woman's tears had fallen onto polished floors. The memory settled over him like dust. He didn't know her name then. He knew it now. Miss Whitmore. The next morning, Clara came down to the stables, skirts brushing the straw. She carried a basket for the kitchen hens, but paused at the sight of him saddling a young mare. For a moment, she thought to turn back, but pride held her still. "You're new," she said quietly. He looked up, that same calm in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am, Jonas Hale. You were at the hall last night. It wasn't a question." He adjusted the reins, nodding once. Her hand tightened around the basket's handle. "You didn't have to do that. Maybe not," he said, "but nobody should stand alone in a room like that." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It just lingered, soft as the morning dust. She nodded, once, and walked on. He watched her go. the hem of her dress catching sunlight, her shoulders squared, in that way people do when they're holding themselves together. Days passed like that, work and quiet. The rhythm of the ranch wrapped them both in its dust and hum. Jonas rose before dawn, fed the horses, checked the fences. Clara helped her father with accounts, carried water to the men, sometimes brought coffee to the corral when the wind turned cold. Their paths crossed often, never planned. A word here, a glance there. Small things, easy to overlook, but not forgotten. One evening, while mending a broken gate, Jonas heard her voice behind him. "You missed a nail." He turned, hammer in hand. "You've got a sharp eye. Miss Whitmore, I was raised on a ranch. Mr. Hale, I know when something's not done right." He smiled a little. "Then maybe you'll check my work tomorrow." She almost smiled back. Almost. But it faded before it reached her eyes. "We'll see," she said, and walked toward the barn. He watched her go, the air between them carrying that soft tension of something too fragile to name. Later that night, when the moon lifted over the ridge, Jonas sat outside the bunkhouse, rolling a cigarette he didn't light. The ranch slept quiet. The fields stretched wide, endless, the stars sharp as nails against the sky. From the big house, a window glowed faintly. Maybe she couldn't sleep either. Maybe she, too, was listening to the night fill itself with wind and memory. He thought of her tears, the way she'd stood straight, even when the world tried to bow her. There was something familiar in that kind of pride. He'd worn it himself, long ago, before the years took it, and replaced it with silence. Now, watching the lamplight fade, he realized some silences were not empty. Some were waiting to be heard. In the days that followed, the rhythm continued, fences mended, calves branded, letters delivered to town, but in the small things, a shared glance, a word left hanging in the air, something unnamed began to take root. Not affection, not yet, just understanding. The kind that doesn't need to speak. And one late afternoon, as the sun dropped low behind the ridge and the sky turned the color of copper, Clara stepped out onto the porch. Jonas rode past on the bay mare, heading for the north pasture. He touched his hat to her in greeting. She hesitated, then lifted her hand in return. It was nothing more than a gesture. But the air shifted, just enough to feel, like the first stir of wind before the storm comes over the plains. The wind carried dust that morning fine, yellow dust from the road that led east toward town, the kind that settles on everything, soft but stubborn, like words that don't belong to the wind, yet find their way into every crack. At Raven Creek Ranch, the day began as any other. The men saddled up, the horses snorted steam into the chill air, and Clara stood on the porch, with her shawl drawn tight. But beneath that calm, something faint and uneasy had begun to stir. A whisper, a name, Texas. It started with the supply wagon that came in from Silver Hollow. The driver, Tom Keene, spat his tobacco and said it like it was nothing. "Heard you've got a man named Hale working here now." He said, "Funny thing, that name came up down at the saloon. Word is he once shot a man in Texas." Samuel Whitmore looked up from the ledger, brow furrowing. "Who told you that?" Tom shrugged. "Came from Callaway, I reckon. Said he heard it himself." He climbed back onto his wagon and rode off, leaving the ranch quiet but changed. Words like that didn't stay still for long. They moved through men's minds like a slow fire. By afternoon, the ranch hands had found reasons to drift away from Jonas, some to the barn, some to the far pasture. He didn't chase them, he never did, just kept working, steady and silent, as if the murmur of gossip were nothing but wind in the grass. Yet even the calmest man feels when the air turns against him. He could taste it. Distrust had its own smell bitter, like cold iron. That evening, as he returned from the north fence, Clara was waiting by the paddock with a lantern in hand. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice low. "People are talking." He paused, unsaddling the mare, the leather creaking in his hands. "About what?" "About Texas," she said. "About someone you killed." The horse snorted, the lantern flame shivered. Jonas didn't answer right away. He placed the saddle on the rail, then looked at her. "You believe them?" Her breath caught. "I don't know what to believe." His gaze dropped to the dirt. "That's fair," he said quietly. Then he walked past her, into the dark, boots heavy against the earth. For a while, she stood there, staring at the barn's shadowed doorway. She thought of that night in the hall, of the way he had stepped toward her without asking why. The calm in his eyes then was the same calm she saw now. It didn't feel like the look of a killer, and yet the rumor had wrapped itself around her thoughts like smoke she couldn't wave away. In town, the talk grew bolder. Andrew Calloway sat at the saloon, turning his glass between his fingers. His fiancée, Eleanor, had gone back east for a visit, and the silence she left behind had turned his pride sour. He didn't mean to start trouble, not really. But when men asked about the stranger working for Whitmore, he told them what he'd heard in Abilene, that Jonas Hale once shot a man dead outside a cantina. He didn't mention the rest because he didn't know it, or maybe he didn't care to. Words spoken in envy don't need truth to travel. By the end of the week, even Samuel called Jonas into his study. The old rancher stood by the window, the room filled with the scent of tobacco and old maps. "They're saying things," Samuel began. "About Texas. You've heard it, I'm sure." Jonas nodded once. "I have. Is it true?" The question hung in the room, like dust in sunlight. Jonas met his eyes. "I won't lie to you, sir. I did shoot a man." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Jonas continued, voice calm, low. He was drunk. Had a gun to a boy's head, a boy from across the border. Couldn't have been more than 15. I told him to drop it. He fired first. Silence. The clock ticked once, then again. "You can send me off your land if you'd rather not have me here," Jonas said finally. "But that's the truth of it." Samuel studied him for a long while, then set his pipe down. "No man should have to explain decency," he said. "Keep your work steady and let the rest blow itself out." Jonas tipped his hat. "Yes, sir." That night, Clara found him out by the corral again, mending a rail in the moonlight. The quiet between them was easier now, like two people who understood the same kind of loneliness. "My father told me," she said, "about the boy." He nodded. "Word travels fast here. It always does," she said softly. "But truth moves slower." He looked at her then, really looked, and there was gratitude in that silence, something unspoken, something like trust beginning to take shape. The next day, when he rode into Silver Hollow for supplies, men at the saloon porch turned their faces away. One spat in the dust. Jonas kept walking. Inside the general store, old Mrs. Elkins handed him his order without meeting his eyes. "We don't want no trouble here," she muttered. "Neither do I," he said, and tipped his hat. Outside, Andrew was waiting, leaning against a post. "You sure know how to stir a quiet town, Hale," he said, a half-smile curling on his lips. "Maybe that's what you're good at riding in, making folks talk." Jonas adjusted the rope, coiled at his saddle. "I didn't come here to be talked about. Then maybe you shouldn't have come at all, Andrew said. Jonas looked at him, eyes steady. Maybe you should stop looking for someone else to blame for what you lost, for a heartbeat. Neither moved. Then Jonas mounted up and rode away, the dust rising between them like a curtain. By evening, the rumor had already begun to fade. Samuel's word carried weight, and when he spoke of what really happened, men listened. They didn't apologize, they just stopped talking. That's how towns work. Truth doesn't erase the lie, it only quiets it. Clara saw him again that night, walking back from the barn with the faint glow of dusk still on his coat. He looked tired, but the weight in his shoulders had eased. She waited on the porch, a shawl over her arms. When he reached the steps, she said, "Mr. Hale, I'm glad you stayed." He hesitated, then tipped his hat. "I wasn't planning to go." She smiled small. "Fleeting, but real. Then I'm glad you didn't." He nodded once, then walked toward the bunkhouse. Behind him, the sun slipped away, and the first stars blinked to life over the ridge. The air smelled of pine and distant rain, and though Silver Hollow slept lighter now, something inside both of them had changed. Not much, just enough to notice, like the soft hum before thunder. The afternoon lay still over the valley, the kind of stillness that comes before something changes. The air hung heavy, full of heat and resin, and the sky over Pine Hill burned a pale gold. Jonas leaned against the corral fence, hat low against the glare, while Clara sat nearby on an overturned bucket, tracing a finger over the rim of her canteen. They had been talking, not much, just small pieces of truth that two quiet people sometimes share when the workday softens, about losing things, about how silence can keep a man alive and how it can also keep him lonely. Her voice had carried a tremor when she spoke of her mother's passing, the kind that made words feel fragile. He listened more than he talked, nodding once in a while, like the sound of her voice itself was enough to fill the empty spaces he'd carried too long. Then, somewhere beyond the ridge, a shout rose up sharp, panicked, breaking the calm in half. "Fire," another voice echoed. "Closer now." Fire on Pine Hill. The stillness shattered. Jonas straightened, scanning the horizon. A thin gray column twisted upward into the bright sky. Within seconds, it darkened, thickened, spread. He turned to Clara. "Stay here," he said, already running for the barn. She called after him, but he was gone before the words left her mouth. Samuel Whitmore met him halfway down the yard, barking orders to the men. "Get the horses, bring the barrels." Jonas swung into the saddle, the bay mare dancing under him, nostrils wide at the scent of smoke, winds shifting south. He said. Samuel nodded grimly. "We'll cut it off at the creek line." Go they rode hard, hooves drumming against the dry ground. The air grew hotter with each mile, the wind carrying flecks of ash that stung the skin. By the time they reached the ridge, the fire had already claimed the first stand of pines. Flames leapt 30 feet high, snapping branches, throwing sparks that flew like angry stars. The noise was like nothing human deep. Roaring, alive, Jonas dismounted, grabbed a shovel from the wagon, and started cutting a trench to slow the blaze. Sweat rolled down his face, turning the dust to mud on his neck. Samuel and the other men joined him, passing buckets in a line, shouting over the wind. The smoke thickened until the world shrank to a blur of orange and shadow. Back at the ranch, Clara stood by the porch rail, hands clenched around her rosary. She could see the glow rising over the ridge, hear the faint thunder of hooves and the crack of burning timber. Every gust carried the smell of pine and fear. She whispered prayers into the dark, her voice trembling. When the wind shifted again, a shower of sparks drifted down the valley like fiery snow. The ranch hands ran to wet the roofs and drive the cattle farther from the fields. She wanted to help, to do something, but all she could do was watch that terrible orange sky out on the hill. The line of men faltered. The wind had turned against them. Jonas wiped his eyes with a soot-black hand. "It's jumping the creek," someone shouted. He looked up just in time to see a gust carry burning branches across the gap. Flames caught on the dry grass near the horse pen below, and then a sound that froze his blood. A child's cry. He ran before he thought, down the slope, through smoke that clawed at his lungs. The heat hit like a wall. But he pushed through. The old stable at the base of the hill was half engulfed. Through the haze, he saw the boy Miguel, one of the ranch hand's sons, curled near a stall door, too scared to move. Jonas pulled his bandana over his mouth and plunged inside. The roof crackled overhead, dropping cinders that hissed on the straw. He reached the boy, lifted him under the arms. "Hold on, kid," he said through the cloth. The child clung to him, coughing. He turned toward the door, but a beam collapsed, blocking the way. The heat seared through his sleeves. He tried another way back through the stalls. The smoke was so thick now, he could barely see his hands. His arms burned, the skin screaming under the heat. He kicked open a side gate, half carrying, half dragging the boy into the open air. They stumbled into the dirt just as the roof gave way behind them, flames roaring like a beast denied its prey. For a moment, Jonas couldn't breathe. The world was nothing but fire and light and sound. Then hands grabbed his shoulders, Samuel's voice through the chaos. "Got him, he's alive." They carried the boy to safety, laid him by the creek where the other women waited with wet cloths. When Clara saw them coming, she ran. The child was crying, but unhurt. Jonas, though, dropped to one knee, his arms a mess of burns and soot. She knelt beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his skin. "You fool," she whispered, tears cutting clean lines down her cheeks. "You could have died." He tried to smile, couldn't let the boy stay in there. His voice was raw, almost gone. She didn't answer, just held his hand, what was left of it, blistered and shaking, and kept her eyes on him as if the act of looking might keep him tethered to the world around them. The fire still burned, but the worst of it was turning north now. Away from the ranch, men shouted, axes rang, water hissed on embers. The night was a battlefield of smoke and orange light. Hours passed before the flames began to fade. When the last sparks died, the valley fell silent again. Only the smell of ash and wet earth remained. The moon came out from behind the smoke, pale and distant, shining on what was left of the stables, charred beams, blackened ground, and the faint trail of footprints leading away from it. Jonas lay on a cot near the barn, wrapped in a blanket. His hands were bandaged, white against the soot that still covered him. Clara sat beside him, too tired to speak. Every so often she'd dip a cloth in cool water and touch his forehead. He would stir, half-conscious, whisper something she couldn't quite hear. Once, she caught a word. "Sorry." She leaned closer. "Don't be," she said softly. "You saved a life. That's more than most can say." Outside, dawn began to creep over the hills, pale and slow. Smoke hung low in the air, curling like ghosts over the blackened ground. The men were already up again, moving quietly, rebuilding. Life goes on, even after fire. Clara looked down at Jonas's bandaged hands. They'd never be the same, but neither would she. Something in her heart had shifted with the fire, something she couldn't yet name. Maybe courage looks like foolishness until it's done. Maybe kindness burns, just as bright as any flame. She brushed a strand of soot-dark hair from his brow and sat back, listening to the faint crackle of dying embers. The world smelled of smoke and change. And though the valley was quiet again, the air held the echo of that roar, the sound of a man stepping through fire for something more than himself. The smell of smoke still lingered in the valley, long after the last ember died. It hung in the wood of the porch, in the folds of blankets, in the air itself, like a memory that refused to fade. Inside the small room, near the kitchen, the fire burned low in the stove, throwing soft light against the walls. Jonas lay on a narrow bed, both hands wrapped thick in white bandages. The rest of him looked whole, but the quiet in his face spoke of pain deeper than skin. Clara sat beside him, her chair close enough that she could hear his breathing. Slow, steady, sometimes rough when the pain took hold. The doctor had left hours ago, leaving a jar of salve and a warning: keep the bandages clean, keep him still. But men like Jonas were not built for stillness. Even in sleep, his body seemed to lean toward motion, as if the trail still called to him somewhere beyond the window. She dipped a cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to his brow. His eyelids fluttered, but did not open. There was a scar along his temple she hadn't noticed before, thin, almost lost beneath the soot. She traced it lightly, wondering how many miles of dust and danger lived behind that one small line. The thought made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand. Outside, the ranch moved on. Hooves clattered in the yard, voices carried from the barn, hammers rang on scorched timber as the men rebuilt what the fire had taken. But in this room, time felt slower. Every sound, each crack of the stove, each sigh from the bed seemed to hang in the air a little longer than it should. She reached for the bowl of porridge cooling on the table. "Jonas," she whispered, "you need to eat." He stirred, his voice rough with sleep. "I'm not hungry." "You will be," she said, her tone firmer than she felt. She scooped a small spoonful, waited for the steam to fade, and lifted it toward him. He hesitated, tried to lift his bandaged hands, and winced. She caught the motion, the pride in it, and set the spoon down for a moment. "You saved a boy," she said softly. "Let someone save you for a while." His eyes opened, then gray, the color of river rock. He looked at her for a long second before nodding once. She fed him slowly, each motion quiet, careful. When he could no longer eat, he closed his eyes again. "You shouldn't have to do this," he murmured. "It's work meant for kin." "Then I'll be that," she said. The words came out before she meant them to, but once spoken, she didn't take them back. He turned his head slightly, studying her, as though the meaning might be something he could hold if his hands still worked. The day passed into dusk. She lit the lamp and sat reading aloud from one of her mother's books, her voice low and even. He didn't follow the story, but the sound of it seemed to ease him. Every so often, she glanced up and found him watching her, a faint smile ghosting across his face. She never asked what he was thinking. Some silences are too sacred for words. When night settled fully, she checked his bandages again. The skin beneath was angry and raw, but clean. He hissed when the cool salve touched him, but didn't pull away. She worked with gentle hands, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You'll heal," she said. "Not sure I'm made for healing," he whispered back. "Everyone is," she said, "even those who don't believe it." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the shutters. The room grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that holds weight. She set the basin aside and leaned back in her chair, too tired to speak, too full to sleep. He shifted on the bed. "Clara," he said after a long pause, "why are you here?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. "Because you would have done the same for anyone," she said. "That's not what I asked." She hesitated, then lowered her eyes. "Because I couldn't stand knowing you were hurting. Not after—" Her voice trailed off. He didn't press her. The lamp flickered once, and in that trembling light, both of them seemed smaller. Two people caught between gratitude and something they didn't yet dare to name. He slept again before she could find more words. His breathing evened out, soft and steady. Clara rose, pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders, then stood for a long while, just looking at him. The lines of pain around his mouth had softened. She wondered what dreams he chased when the world went dark. Maybe he was back on some quiet trail, before Texas, before all of it. Maybe he dreamed of a life without fire. The lamp hissed softly as it burned low. She opened the window to let the cool night in. The stars were clear again, sharp and endless, as if the fire had never happened. Somewhere, an owl called from the ridge. She sat back down and rested her head against the bedpost, her eyes growing heavy. For the first time in a long while, her mind was quiet. Before dawn, Jonas woke to the sound of her breathing beside him. She'd fallen asleep in the chair, her shawl slipping to the floor. The soft light from the stove flickered across her face, tracing every tired line, every stubborn bit of grace. He tried to lift a hand, just to touch the fabric of her sleeve, but the pain stopped him short, so he watched instead, and in that stillness, he understood something simple kindness, when freely given, weighs more than any burden. He closed his eyes again, letting the thought settle deep, where words couldn't reach. The first rooster crowed outside. Morning crept across the fields, silver and slow. Smoke still rose from the far hills, thin as breath. In the small room, time seemed to hold still a little longer, two souls caught in that fragile place between pain and peace. And as the sun finally reached the window, Clara stirred awake. She lifted her head, saw his eyes open, and smiled softly, shyly, like the first light touching the earth. "Good morning," she whispered. "Morning," he answered. His voice was quiet, but steady. She reached for the pitcher to pour water, her hand brushing the edge of his bandage by accident. He didn't flinch. Instead, he met her gaze. A faint warmth flickering there, something not yet spoken, but real enough to feel. Outside, the ranch was waking, hammers striking, horses calling for feed, but in that small room near the kitchen, the world moved slower, gentler. Pain had made its home there, but so had something else. Something that might, in time, take its place. The days stretched long after the fire, each one slower, gentler, as if the land itself was catching its breath. The air still smelled faintly of ash, but new shoots of grass had begun to push through the black soil. Life has a way of finding its footing again, even after the ground's been scorched. Inside the small room near the kitchen, the window stayed open to let the wind move through, soft and cool, carrying the sound of distant hammers and the low murmur of men rebuilding fences. Jonas was sitting up now, though every movement came with care. His hands were still wrapped, stiff from healing, but the pain had eased into something dull and bearable. Clara sat at the table, mending a torn sleeve, her needle glinting in the afternoon light. Neither spoke much. They didn't have to. The silence between them had changed, It wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind of quiet that comes when words aren't needed. She glanced up now and then, catching him watching her, and each time he turned his gaze toward the window, pretending to study the hills. It made her smile, just a little. She'd grown used to his stillness the way he seemed part of the room itself, like the wooden beams or the smell of coffee in the morning. Once, she might have thought that kind of quiet meant distance. Now she knew better. Some people love by simply staying close. He tried more and more each day to use his hands again. She'd catch him flexing his fingers when he thought she wasn't looking, grimacing when the pain shot through. One afternoon, she came in and found the bowl of water spilled on the floor, his bandages wet, his jaw clenched with frustration. She knelt beside him without a word, mopping up the mess with her apron. "You're supposed to wait," she said softly. "I'm done waiting," he muttered. She looked up at him then, and there was something fierce and tired in his eyes that made her heart twist. "You're not the kind of man who sits still," she said. "But maybe that's why you need to learn how—" He let out a slow breath and leaned back against the chair. The room fell quiet again, except for the drip of water from the cloth. When she finished, she sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. Neither of them moved away. At night, when the ranch went still, Clara sometimes found herself awake long after the lamps were out. She'd sit by the window and watch the moonlight touch the fields, thinking of all the ways life can turn on a single choice: a dance, a fire, a stranger's kindness. Once, she had dreamed of perfection, a husband with clean boots and gentle words, a life as neat as the lace on her dresses. But those dreams had burned away like the pines on the hill. What was left was simpler, steadier. Not perfection, but peace. She turned to look at Jonas sleeping, his bandaged hands resting on his chest, and felt something quiet bloom inside her. Not the sharp ache of infatuation, but the slow warmth of understanding. The next morning, she helped him outside for the first time since the fire. The air was crisp, the world washed clean by a night rain. He stood by the fence, breathing it in, eyes closed for a moment. "Smells like new ground," he said. "It does," she answered. They walked slowly to the edge of the yard, where the blackened trees stood like sentinels against the horizon. "You ever think," he said after a while, "how something can burn so bad and still leave room for life to grow?" She looked at him, unsure if he meant the land or himself. "Maybe that's the only way things grow," she said. He nodded, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. As the days passed, color returned to his face, strength to his body. The other men began to stop by, bringing news or jokes from the fields. Samuel would nod approvingly from the doorway, watching his daughter move around the room with a softness he hadn't seen in her for years. It wasn't just Jonas who'd changed. Clara had too. Her laughter, once polite and distant, now carried warmth, like the hum of a remembered tune. Even the house seemed different when she was near, less cold, more alive. One afternoon, as she read aloud to him by the window, her voice stumbled over a line. Jonas chuckled. It was a quiet, rusty sound, but real. "You skipped a word," he said. "Did I twice?" She smiled, closing the book. "Maybe the story's better that way." He shook his head, still smiling. "You think everything can be fixed by changing the story?" "Not everything," she said. "But sometimes, starting again helps." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then said softly, "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she replied. "It just starts small. like a scar that doesn't hurt anymore when you touch it. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved to the window, to the horizon glowing red in the late light. "Clara," he said at last, "you've been kind to me, more than I deserve." She started to protest, but he lifted a hand just enough to stop her. "Let me say it," he murmured. "Most of my life, I never stayed anywhere long enough to see a sunrise twice from the same porch. Always figured the road was safer than people. But lately," he paused, searching for words that didn't come easily. "You make me think maybe I was wrong." Her throat tightened, the world suddenly too still. He turned back to her, his voice low. "You make me believe I stopped where I was meant to." The room felt smaller then, filled with something that wasn't quite silence, wasn't quite speech. She didn't move, didn't need to. Some words are like embers. You don't touch them. You just feel their heat long after they're spoken. Outside, the sun dipped below the ridge, leaving the room washed in amber light. Dust motes drifted through the air, slow as snow. She reached out, hesitated, then rested her hand lightly over his bandaged fingers. He didn't flinch, he just looked at her, eyes steady, the faintest tremor in his breath. They stayed that way until the last light left the window, until the only sound was the whisper of the wind against the eaves. The day was ending, but something in them had just begun, something tender, something real, something built not on promises, but on presence. And as night crept in, the ranch quiet again. A soft glow still lingered in that small room. The fire in the stove crackled low. The air smelled faintly of coffee and clean bandages. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt completely still, not waiting, not remembering, just being. Beyond the hills, a coyote called once, long and lonesome, then fell silent. She turned toward Jonas, who was watching the dark through the open window, and thought not for the first time that maybe peace doesn't come when everything is perfect. Maybe it comes when you finally stop running. By late summer, the scent of smoke had faded from the valley, replaced by the sweet, dry breath of hay and sun-warmed earth. The land healed the way people did quietly, without asking for attention. The grass grew back on Pine Hill, soft and green over the blackened ground, and the town of Silver Hollow learned to speak a new name with a little more respect: Jonas Hale. Folks said it differently now, softer at the edges, like they were ashamed of how they'd said it before. When he rode into town for supplies, people nodded first, some even smiled. Old Mrs. Elkins, who once refused him service, now slipped an extra loaf of bread into his sack without a word. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder, said something about bravery and fire and luck. Jonas didn't care for talk like that, but he nodded all the same. A man doesn't argue with gratitude. He stayed mostly at the ranch, though there was work to be done, fences to mend, and a life, somehow, that felt worth building. His hands, still stiff with scars, learned new ways to move. He couldn't hold a rope like he used to, couldn't draw his revolver clean anymore, but he could hammer, saw, and tie. He could build things that stayed. Samuel would sometimes stand beside him, both men quiet, watching the posts take their place along the ridgeline. "Looks good," the old rancher would say. Jonas would nod. Neither needed more than that. Clara was out in the yard most days now, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a strip of linen. She moved through the work like someone who'd always belonged to it, her hands knowing what needed doing before she did. Sometimes, when she passed him a tool or helped hold a board steady, their fingers brushed, and the touch lingered just a little too long, not enough for anyone else to notice, enough for them. In the evenings, they sat outside the bunkhouse with coffee cooling in tin cups. The sun would slide behind the ridge, painting the sky in gold and smoke, and they'd talk in the slow way people do when silence has already said most of what needs saying. "Your hands are healing," she'd remark, eyes on the horizon, "a little each day." He'd answer, then quiet again. The cicadas would fill the gaps. The rumor of the fire had long reached Silver Hollow. Stories travel fast, and this one traveled kindly. They said Jonas Hale had ridden through flames to save a child, that he'd stood between death and a boy who wasn't even his kin. Some swore they saw his coat catch fire, and he never flinched. Some said he went in twice. None of it mattered to Jonas. He didn't do it to be remembered. But the town remembered anyway. One afternoon, as he was loading supplies, a familiar voice called from across the street, "Andrew Calloway." He looked different now, his fine coat wrinkled from travel, his eyes a little hollow. He stepped closer, hat in hand. "Jonas," he said, "I heard what you did." Jonas tightened the strap on his saddle, not looking up. "Fire makes men do what they can," he said. Andrew nodded, swallowing hard. "Still, I owe you an apology for things I said before, for the way I looked at you." The words hung in the air, awkward and heavy. Jonas met his eyes at last. "Some things burn out on their own," he said. "No need to stir the ashes." Andrew looked down, then offered his hand. Jonas hesitated, then took it. The grip was brief but honest. When Andrew walked away, Jonas exhaled, long and quiet. Forgiveness, he thought, was a different kind of work, slow, hard, but worth the effort. That evening, Clara noticed the change in him. He carried himself lighter, as though the dust of old wrongs had finally settled. "Something happened in town," she said. He nodded, sipping his coffee. "A man said, 'Sorry.' And I listened." She smiled softly. "That's more than most can do." As the weeks turned, so did the season. The first hints of fall touched the cottonwoods, their leaves flashing gold in the late sun. Jonas helped Samuel prepare the fields for winter, mending troughs, chopping wood. Clara brought meals to the men, and when the day ended, she and Jonas walked the path back to the house together. Sometimes their shoulders brushed, sometimes they didn't, but each evening felt like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. One night, as the air grew cool and the stars came out one by one, she found him in the barn, oiling the saddle that had carried him through fire. "You planning to leave?" she asked quietly. He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "No," he said after a moment. "Not anymore." She nodded, relief blooming somewhere deep. "The town sees you differently now," she said. "Maybe, or maybe I just started seeing myself different." He looked down at his hands, the scars pale against the lamplight. "Guess it's strange, being known for one good thing after a lifetime of running from the bad." "It's not strange," she said. "It's fair." He smiled, faint but true. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," she whispered. "But you make it look like it could be." The barn went quiet again, filled only with the soft sound of leather under his cloth. Then she reached out, brushing her fingers against the back of his hand, light as breath. He didn't move, didn't speak. The moment held fragile, steady, real. Outside, a cold wind began to roll down from the hills, stirring the dry grass. The lantern swayed, throwing their shadows long across the walls. He looked at her, and in that dim, flickering light, he saw not the rancher's daughter or the woman he'd once pitied at a dance, but someone who had stood beside fire and come through shining, someone who had saved him in quieter ways. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Clara," he said, "you ever wonder how two people find each other in a world this wide?" She smiled, eyes soft. "Maybe they don't," she said. "Maybe they just stop walking when it feels right." He nodded, a slow, thoughtful nod. Then he set the saddle aside and leaned back against the stall door, the lamplight catching the curve of his jaw, the faint silver of his scars. "Feels right here," he said quietly. The words hung between them, warm as the firelight once was, and Clara didn't look away. Outside, the wind sighed through the cottonwoods, scattering a few golden leaves across the yard. In that sound, there was something like peace, earned, not given. They stood there a while longer, two figures outlined in soft light and silence, neither reaching for more than the moment offered, and when the lantern finally burned low, the last glow touched their faces like the end of a prayer. The ranch slept, the town rested, and somewhere in the dark, a feeling took root, quiet and strong, the kind that doesn't need words to last. The night air carried the faint smell of pine smoke and new paint, the scent of a town trying to heal itself. Silver Hollow hadn't gathered like this since the fire. The old town hall stood dressed again in lanterns and ribbon, its windows glowing amber against the autumn dark. From inside came the sound of music, a fiddle, a banjo, a piano missing one key but still trying. Laughter drifted through the open doors, mingling with the smell of cider and fresh bread. It was the charity dance for the families who'd lost their homes, a night meant to mend something deeper than fences or roofs. Clara Whitmore stood before the mirror in her room, fastening the clasp of her mother's brooch. Her hands were steady. The dress she wore wasn't new, just mended the same soft blue she'd once worn on a night that ended in tears. She looked at her reflection, the woman staring back at her, and saw something quiet but strong in the eyes. Not the girl who waited to be chosen. Someone who'd learned how to stand on her own. Downstairs, Jonas waited, his coat brushed, his hat in hand. The scars on his knuckles had faded to pale silver. When she stepped into the lamplight, he straightened, saying nothing at first. Then, softly, "You sure about this?" "Yes," she said, meeting his eyes. "It's time." They rode together into town, the moon just beginning to rise over the ridge. The road was dusted with fallen leaves, their horses' hooves muffled against the dirt. Neither spoke much. There was no need. The silence between them was its own kind of courage. When they reached the edge of Silver Hollow, the town square shimmered with light and sound. People milled about the hall ranchers, merchants, widows, and children running between the wagons. The music spilled into the street like laughter that had been held too long. Jonas tied the horses to a post. He looked at her once more. "We can still turn back," he said quietly. "Not tonight," she replied, and offered her hand. He hesitated only a second before taking it. Her fingers were warm. "Sure." Together they climbed the steps. The wooden boards creaked beneath their boots, the same sound that had once haunted her dreams. And then they were inside. The room stilled, not silent, but close. The kind of hush that falls when memory walks back through the door. Heads turned. A few whispers rose, faint but sharp. Somewhere near the back, someone dropped a spoon. Clara felt all those eyes like heat on her skin. For a heartbeat, she thought she might falter. But Jonas's hand tightened slightly around hers, not to lead, not to claim, only to steady. She drew a slow breath, lifted her chin, and stepped forward. One pace, then another. The floorboards beneath her boots sounded like the beat of a heart that had stopped running from itself. They crossed the hall, passing the very spot where she'd once stood, frozen in shame. Now, she walked with her head high. The music began again, a waltz, soft and measured, the same melody that had bound them once before. She looked up at Jonas, and the faintest smile touched her lips. "Do you remember?" "I do," he said. "I remember how it began." He took her hand, careful with his grip, the old scars meeting her smooth skin, and there, beneath the lanterns, they began to dance. It wasn't perfect. His hands were slower than they'd been, his movements deliberate, but she followed easily, the rhythm between them sure. Around them, the crowd began to breathe again. Some smiled, some turned away, others clapped softly in time. Near the edge of the floor, Andrew Calloway stood beside his wife, his expression unreadable. When Clara's gaze met his, he gave a small nod, not of regret, but of respect. She returned it, a quiet acknowledgement of something long finished. As they turned beneath the chandeliers, the world seemed to soften the music, the faces, the whispers. For the first time, she felt no weight in her chest. The hall that had once broken her now held her upright. Each step, each spin, was a reclaiming, not from others, but from the part of herself that had once believed she wasn't enough. Jonas said nothing. He didn't have to. His presence beside her spoke the words she'd waited a lifetime to hear. "You are seen. You are safe." When the song ended, the crowd broke into applause. She bowed slightly, her hand still in his. The sound washed over them, but she hardly heard it. She was watching Jonas, the way the light caught in his hair, the way he smiled, small and uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe the moment was real. She reached up, brushed a bit of dust from his shoulder. "You did well, Mr. Hale. I just followed your lead," he said. They stepped outside after a while, the air cool and filled with the scent of autumn. The street was quiet except for the faint echo of music spilling through the open door. Clara leaned against the rail, looking up at the moon hanging low above the rooftops. "Funny," she murmured, "how the same place can feel different just because we are—" Jonas joined her, resting his hands on the rail. "Maybe places don't change," he said. "Maybe people just finally see what was always there." For a long moment, neither spoke. The night wrapped around them calm, sure, steady. Then she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know," she said, "last time I walked out of this hall, I thought I'd lost everything." He looked at her, his gray eyes soft under the moonlight. "And now," she said, "I think I've found what mattered." He smiled, the kind of smile that begins deep and takes its time reaching the surface. "You've got courage." "Clara Whitmore," he said quietly. "I just borrowed some from you." She answered. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You had it all along." The door behind them opened, spilling a rush of laughter and warm light onto the street. Somewhere inside, the fiddler began another tune livelier this time, bright as the future waiting just beyond the ridge. Clara reached for Jonas's hand once more. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." He looked down at their joined hands, rough and soft, scarred and whole, and nodded. Together they walked down the steps, their shadows long in the moonlight. The night air shimmered faintly with dust and music, like the memory of something burning, but this time, it wasn't pain, it was light. And as they rode back toward the ranch, the lanterns of Silver Hollow fading behind them, Clara glanced over her shoulder one last time. The town glowed golden against the dark, no longer a place of hurt, but of return. She smiled to herself, the wind catching her hair. The girl who once wept on that floor was gone. In her place rode a woman who had chosen her own peace. The stars stretched wide above, silent witnesses to two riders on a dirt road, heading home together steady, side by side, beneath the same quiet moon. The hall had quieted by the time they stepped outside. The last notes of the fiddle drifted through the open windows, soft as smoke, fading into the night. Lantern light spilled in uneven patches across the porch boards, mingling with the silver wash of the moon. Beyond the yard, the fields stretched wide and still, a sea of pale grass under the stars. The laughter from inside sounded far away now, like another lifetime entirely. Clara leaned against the wooden rail, drawing in the cool air that smelled of dust and apple cider. Her pulse was slowing, though her hands still trembled slightly. Not from fear this time, but from something quieter, deeper, behind her. Jonas closed the door. The faint creak of its hinges seemed loud in the hush that followed. He stood for a moment, hat in hand, looking out at the hills where the moonlight touched the charred remains of Pine Ridge. Even in ruin, the place looked peaceful. "You did well in there," he said finally. His voice was low, roughened by the trail and the years, but there was warmth in it. She smiled faintly, not turning. "So did you. Didn't expect the town to clap," he said. "Didn't expect I'd ever be the kind of man people clapped for." She looked over her shoulder at him, her eyes steady. "They didn't clap for the fire," she said softly. "They clapped for who you are." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set his hat on the rail beside her, rubbing a thumb along the brim. "I've been called a lot of things," he murmured. "Hero wasn't one of them." "Then maybe it's time," she said. "Maybe it's been time for a while." The wind shifted, stirring the loose strands of her hair. He watched as she tucked them behind her ear, the movement small, unthinking, but it caught him anyway. He'd seen her frightened, furious, proud, but this was different. There was a calm about her now, a kind of light that didn't come from the moon, and standing there, with the night so wide around them, he felt something rise in his chest that had no name, but had been waiting a long time. He took a slow breath. "Clara," he said, her name carrying quiet weight in the dark. She turned to face him fully. "There's something I've been meaning to say." His hands tightened around the rail, the old scars on his knuckles catching the light. "I ain't a man of fancy words," he said, "and I've never been good at saying what's in my chest. But tonight," he paused, swallowed hard. "Tonight I don't want to keep it in anymore." She didn't move, didn't speak, only waited. The music inside had stopped. The world had gone still. "I love you," he said quietly. No grand gesture, no trembling declaration, just truth, simple as breath. "I don't know when it started. Maybe when you sat by my bed reading that old book. Or maybe that first night, when you didn't look away while everyone else did. But I know it's been there. And it's not going anywhere. For a heartbeat." She said nothing. The moonlight caught the line of her jaw, the softness in her eyes. Then she stepped closer, so close he could feel the warmth of her. "Jonas Hale," she whispered, "you don't need to prove anything to me. I already knew." He blinked, almost as if the words had struck something tender in him. You did. Yes. She smiled then, small and sure. I didn't choose you because you saved a child, or because the town forgave you. I chose you because, when I'm with you, my heart is quiet. Something loosened in him then, something that had been bound for years. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. You make it sound easy, he murmured. It isn't, she said, but it's right. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd lived through, everything they hadn't said, everything waiting between them. He reached out, slow, almost afraid to break the moment, and touched her cheek. His hand was rough, the scarred skin cool against her warmth. She leaned into it, eyes half closed. You sure? He asked, barely above a whisper. I've never been surer, she said. And then, with a steadiness that came from every hardship behind them, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It wasn't the kind of kiss that blazed and vanished. It was soft, careful, as if they were both learning what it meant to be unafraid again. His hand found the back of her neck. Hers rested over his heart. The world narrowed to breath, to touch, to the faint sound of the wind moving through the trees. For the first time in years, Jonas forgot the road behind him. He forgot Texas, the whispers, the fire. There was only her, and the way her lips trembled slightly before stilling against his. When they finally parted, she didn't step back right away. Her forehead rested against his, her voice barely audible. You see, she whispered, peace. He smiled, a low, unsteady laugh slipping through his breath. You're something. Clara Whitmore. So are you, she said, and the way she looked at him then made him believe it might even be true. They stood together on the porch, the night deepening around them. The lantern behind the door flickered, throwing a soft golden glow that mingled with the silver of the moon. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close, and she let herself lean into him. The warmth between them was simple, unhurried, like the quiet heartbeat of the land itself. Down in the valley, the river gleamed faintly under the stars. The wind carried the low murmur of the town settling into sleep. Everything felt hushed, suspended as though even time had decided to stand still for a while. Jonas glanced at the moon, then back at her. You ever think, he said, how strange it is that something good can come from so much hurt? She tilted her head, considering, maybe that's how it always works. She said, fire leaves ash, but ash feeds the ground. He nodded, quiet. Then he reached for her hand again, threading his fingers through hers, the scars brushing softly against her skin. Then I guess we're the proof, he said. She smiled. Yes. She whispered, we are. The porch boards creaked as they stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the light fade from the windows. Above them, the moon burned bright and full, casting their shadows long across the yard. It was the same light that had once watched her cry, that had seen him drift through 100 lonely miles. Now it watched them together still, quiet, whole, and for the first time, neither looked away. The morning came golden and still, the kind that makes everything feel softer, the air, the light, even the sound of boots on dirt. Jonas rose before the sun, as he often did, and stepped out onto the porch. The horizon was a thin line of amber, stretching wide over the Wyoming plain. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen window, and somewhere in the distance, Clara's laughter mixed with the low rumble of her father's voice. For a moment, Jonas just stood there, his hat in his hands, watching the day unfold. He had known many mornings in many places, but none had ever felt like this solid, steady, full of belonging. When Samuel Whitmore came out to meet him, the old rancher's steps were slower than they used to be, but his eyes still held that same sharp light. "You've done good work, Jonas," he said, handing him a mug. "Raven Creek's stronger for having you here." Jonas nodded, taking the coffee, unsure what to say. Compliments weren't things he knew how to hold. Samuel went on. "A man who stands by his word deserves more than wages. You've earned your place here, a quarter share of this land that's yours. If you'll take it." The words settled between them like dust after a long ride. Jonas blinked, half certain he'd misheard. "Sir? I can't." "You can't," Samuel interrupted. "And you will. You've brought this family through fire. Boy, it's time you had a stake in the soil you've been saving." The old man turned toward the fields then, his gaze far away. "Besides," he added, his voice quieter, "a man needs something to build for, not just to survive for." Jonas stood there a long while after Samuel walked off. The words weighed on him, not like a burden, but like a gift, too big to carry, all at once. He looked out across the pasture, where the grass swayed gold in the morning light, and thought about roots, how they take time, how they hold, even when the wind comes hard. For the first time, he let himself imagine staying, really staying. That evening, when the sun began to fall, he saddled his horse and rode into town. The sky burned orange behind him, the wind cool on his face. He carried in his pocket a small pouch of coins and something far heavier, a decision. The bell above Owen Miller's shop chimed when he entered. The jeweler looked up from his bench, glasses perched low on his nose. "Evening. Hale? What brings you in?" Jonas took off his hat. "Need a ring," he said simply. Owen's brow lifted, but he didn't smile. "For the Whitmore girl, I'd wager—" Jonas chuckled softly. "Word gets around. In this town, it travels faster than the wind," Owen said, reaching for his tools. "What did you have in mind?" Jonas opened his hand. Resting there were 2 small gold coins, worn smooth by time. "These belonged to Clara's mother," he said. "Her father gave them to me, said they were meant for something good." Owen turned one over between his fingers, nodding. "Fine gold," he said. And the stone Jonas hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and produced a small velvet pouch. Inside was a sapphire, deep blue as the Wyoming sky after rain. "Found it years ago in a trading post down in Abilene," he said. "Never knew what to do with it till now." Owen smiled. "That's a fine choice. Blue like home." "That's what I was thinking," Jonas murmured. He watched as the jeweler set to work, melting, shaping, hammering, each motion, careful, deliberate. When the band was finished, polished and bright, Owen placed it in a small wooden box and slid it across the counter. "She's a lucky woman," he said. Jonas shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I'm the lucky one." He rode back under a sky turning violet, the stars just beginning to stir. The ring sat in his pocket, its weight, small but sure, like a heartbeat. When he reached the ranch, the lamps were still burning in the windows. He found Clara in the garden behind the house, trimming wild roses before the frost set in. The evening light brushed her hair with the color of honey. She turned when she heard his steps. "You're late," she said, smiling. "I had business in town. Business important kind." She set down her scissors, wiping her hands on her apron. "What kind of business brings that look to your face?" she asked. He stepped closer, his boots whispering through the grass. "The kind that changes everything," he said. Then he stopped, standing only a few feet away. "Clara," he began, and the name came out rough, the way truth sometimes does. "I've spent most of my life moving from one place to the next, one job to another. Never figured I'd find somewhere that felt like mine, but I did." He looked at her then, his eyes steady in the fading light. "It's here, with you." She didn't speak, not yet. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and wood smoke. Somewhere behind them, a horse snorted in the barn. Jonas reached into his pocket, pulled out the small box, and opened it. The sapphire caught the last fire of the sunset, burning blue and gold all at once. "Your mother's gold," he said softly, "and a stone the color of the Wyoming sky. I reckon that's as close to forever as a man can promise." He dropped to one knee, the motion slow but sure. "Clara Whitmore," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "will you marry me for a heartbeat?" The world held its breath. Then she knelt too, her hands trembling as she reached for his. "Jonas," she said, her voice breaking on his name. "You don't have to ask. Maybe not," he said, "but I want to." She laughed then, through her tears, and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been waiting there all along. The light caught the sapphire and scattered it across her hand, little sparks of blue in the dusk. Jonas rose, pulling her gently to her feet. For a long time, they just stood there, forehead to forehead, the world around them fading into gold. "You're sure," he murmured. "I've never been surer," she said. "Not about you." The sun slipped below the ridge, leaving the garden awash in the honeyed glow of evening. The air was cool now, the first hint of autumn creeping in. They stood hand in hand, watching the last light fade, the ring glinting softly between them. No grand words, no noise, just the steady rhythm of two hearts finding the same pace. Later, when the stars came out and the crickets began their low song, Jonas turned to her once more. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere," he said quietly. "But maybe belonging isn't a place. Maybe it's a person." She smiled, eyes bright even in the dark. "Then you found yours," she said, "and so have I." The wind moved through the roses, carrying their scent across the yard. The lamps inside flickered warm against the window panes, and the house behind them felt alive, not just with light, but with love that had been earned, not given. Jonas lifted her hand, kissed the sapphire softly, and whispered, "Thank you," for what she asked. He smiled. The kind of smile that comes after a lifetime of waiting, for being the reason I stopped running. And there, in the soft gold of that Wyoming dusk, they stood wrapped in the quiet kind, of forever, the kind built not from promises, but from the peace of finally finding home. The morning mist hovered low over Raven Creek, soft and silver against the trunks of the birch trees. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, the first crisp hint of autumn settling in. Clara stood near the small stream, adjusting the hem of her mother's wedding dress, its lace still delicate despite the years. Her hands trembled only a little, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment, a lifetime compressed into the quiet breath before the first step down the aisle. Jonas waited nearby, his coat brushed, boots clean, the lines of his face softened by the light, but his eyes carried that same steadfast strength that had always held her steady. The stream murmured beside them, moving slowly over smooth stones, carrying with it the echoes of all that had come before the fire. The tears, the long rides across dust and sky, Clara's father, Samuel, stood a few feet away, hand resting on a cane, his eyes bright under the brim of his hat. He watched her closely, the silence stretching out like a bridge over all the years they had weathered together. Finally, he motioned toward Jonas, and the old, steady voice that had raised her through storms and work rang soft and sure. "Clara," he said, "you've found your path. Hold him now, as the land holds water after a rain. Let it sustain you both." She turned, meeting Jonas's gaze. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and he reached out, tucking it behind her ear with a tenderness that belied the roughness of his hands. No words were needed. The look between them said enough, the quiet understanding of scars healed, of patience tested, of courage returned. They walked together under the white birch, each step falling gently on the fallen leaves, the sound muted, soft, like a rhythm they had known all along. The officiant waited beneath the largest tree, his coat hanging loosely, hands folded over the Bible he rarely opened but always carried. Clara's heart beat steadily as she reached Jonas's side. He took her hand, brushing the coolness of her fingers with his scarred ones, gripping lightly but surely. In that simple touch was every story they had shared, every fear, every flame, every quiet evening beside the stove. The world beyond the birch seemed to dissolve. Only the two of them remained in that small, amber light. "Do you take this woman," the officiant began, voice steady, "to be your wife, to walk beside her, to carry her when the path is rough, and to share the quiet moments that make life full?" Jonas looked into her eyes, the sunlight catching the sapphire on her finger, and nodded. "And I do," he said, his voice low and unwavering. Clara's eyes glistened as she lifted her gaze to him. "And do you take this man," the officiant continued, "to be your husband, to walk with him, to share in all storms and sunlight, to keep him in your heart as he keeps you in his?" She squeezed his hand, the warmth grounding her, steadying her breath. "I do," she whispered, voice full of everything that had been held back, everything that had waited for this moment. Samuel placed her hand gently into Jonas's. "Keep each other," he said softly, "like the earth holds water, like the roots of these trees, deep, enduring, patient." And then he stepped back, allowing the world to shrink to the space beneath the white birch. The music began a waltz, slow and steady, the melody that had once saved her in a moment of despair, now rising again under the branches. Jonas led her into the small clearing, their steps measured, careful, like they were retracing the paths of their past. Around them, the leaves rustled, and the stream murmured along as if applauding the dance of two people who had fought their way back to one another. Clara rested her head lightly against his shoulder, the familiar scent of leather and dust filling her senses, a comfort she had once feared she would never find again. Their first steps were tentative, then assured. The waltz carried them forward, each turn a memory, each pivot a promise. Jonas's hand on her back was firm, protective, yet gentle, guiding her across the soft ground. She felt the pull of his steady heartbeat beneath her palm, the cadence matching the rhythm of her own. The music seemed to lift them above time itself, bridging the distance between loss and the present, between the girl who had cried on a dance floor and the woman who now chose her own path. The small crowd friends, neighbors, a few distant relatives, watched silently, respectful of the quiet intimacy of the moment. No clamor, no interference, only the hush of admiration and the rustle of leaves. It was the kind of witness that holds no judgment, only recognition, And as the waltz wound down, Clara lifted her face to Jonas's. The sunlight caught the edges of her tears, golden and fleeting, and she smiled. "We made it," she whispered. He smiled too, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Yes," he said, "we did." And in that quiet, beneath the white birch, beside the murmuring creek, it was more than a wedding. It was a settlement of all their fears, all their wanderings, the land around them, the sky above, the water below, all of it seemed to hold them steady. Like Samuel had said, like the roots of trees holding the soil through seasons of drought and storm. As the music faded, they stood together for a long while, hands clasped, watching the sun dip low in the west, casting long shadows across the garden and the water. The light shimmered in the stream, and in that reflection, Clara saw not just herself, but all the days that had led to this one, and beside her, Jonas stood, steady as the land, as patient as the earth, ready to face the years to come with her. The wind lifted, scattering leaves across the grass. The birch trees whispered their approval in the soft, sighing rustle of branches. Clara leaned into Jonas, shoulder against chest. And for the first time since the fire, she felt completely at home. No past could touch her now, no mistake, no regret, only the steady, enduring present, the waltz of two hearts finally aligned beneath the birch, beneath the sky, beside the creek that had carried away old sorrows. And as the first stars appeared overhead, twinkling like distant promises, Clara and Jonas began the quiet, lasting journey of life together, the world folding softly around them, holding them safe. The wind over Silver Hollow had softened with age. It no longer howled through the canyons the way it once did, but drifted low and slow across the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and horses and old stories that refused to die. Out by Raven Creek Ranch, the fields were wide and golden, stretching farther than the eye could hold, and in the middle of that quiet sea of grass stood a man who had once been a wanderer. Jonas Hale rested his hand on the fence rail, the wood worn smooth under his palm. His hair had silvered at the temples, his shoulders still broad but slower to rise each morning. From the porch behind him came the laughter of two children, bright, unbroken laughter, the kind that made the years feel weightless. Clara's voice followed, calm and steady, calling them in for supper. Jonas turned toward the sound, and the sight of her, still in that blue dress she favored for evenings, caught him the same way it had the first time he'd seen her across that dance hall, under lantern light and heartbreak. Only now, the years had given her something even softer than beauty, peace. She smiled when she met his eyes, and that was all. That was everything. He leaned against the post, the sunset spilling honey-colored light across the land. The ring on her hand still caught that light sometimes, flashing blue like the Wyoming sky it had been meant to mirror. He remembered the day he'd set it there, the feel of her fingers trembling just slightly, the way her yes had sounded, less like a word and more like a promise whispered into eternity. He'd built fences, barns, and new fields since then, but that memory, that small, perfect moment, had built something far sturdier inside him. The years had rolled over Silver Hollow like slow thunder. The town had changed, grown a little, but it still kept its heart. Folks still met at the old saloon on Saturdays, the same piano still leaning against the wall, its keys a little more out of tune now. There were new names in the pews at Sunday service, new hands in the harvest each fall. And yet, when talk turned quiet near the fire or in the back rooms of the general store. Someone always found their way back to that story. The one about the girl who'd wept in front of the whole town, and the cowboy who'd asked her to dance. Some said it had been fate. Others said it was just kindness. But the old-timers, the ones who'd seen it happen, they said it was something simpler. They said it was decency. That a man's worth wasn't measured by his past, but by what he chose to do when someone else's pride lay broken at his feet. He could have walked away, they'd say, staring into their whiskey, but he didn't. Out in the pasture, the children chased each other between the fence posts, their shouts echoing through the dusk. Jonas watched them for a while, his hat tilted low, the same way he used to when gauging a storm. But there was no storm in him now, just a stillness that had taken years to earn. He remembered Texas sometimes, the gunfire, the dust, the mistake that had branded him a killer. He remembered the night of the fire, the burn on his hands that had never quite healed right, but none of it hurt the way it used to, not when he saw what had grown from it, from him. He walked toward the house as the lamps began to glow through the windows. Clara stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, her eyes warm in the fading light. "You coming in?" she asked. He smiled. "Just taking a minute," he said. She nodded, understanding more than words could ever say. That had always been their way. The spaces between their sentences spoke louder than speech. He looked past her to the table inside, 2 plates already set for the children, a loaf of bread, a pot of stew steaming soft in the lamplight. He felt something catch in his chest, not pain, but a kind of gratitude that came with age, when a man knew how easily such moments could have been lost to a different road. Clara stepped out onto the porch, her shawl brushing against his arm. "Cold tonight," she said softly. "Feels like snow." He nodded. "We'll bring the horses in early." She leaned into him then, just for a moment, her head resting against his shoulder. They stood that way until the sky turned the color of ash and lavender, the first stars flickering like shy promises overhead. From far off came the sound of a harmonica faint, carried on the wind from town. Someone was playing an old waltz. The same one. Maybe. Jonas felt the rhythm stir in him, gentle and familiar. Clara heard it too. She lifted her head and smiled, that half smile she had when she was remembering something dear, without a word. He reached for her hand. Her fingers slid into his, sure and steady. "Here?" she asked, laughing quietly. "Here," he said. And beneath the wide Wyoming sky, they began to sway, slow and unhurried, to music that might have been miles away or only in their hearts. The children peeked through the window, giggling, but to Jonas and Clara, the world had fallen away. Again, no ranch, no years, no distance between who they were and who they'd become. Just the feel of her hand in his, the soft press of her head against his chest, the smell of hay and home all around them. When the song faded, they didn't speak. Clara lifted her face and looked at him, and he saw in her eyes the reflection of everything they'd built: the forgiveness, the faith, the quiet victories no one else could see. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Jonas smiled faintly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "You kept me," he said. Silence followed, the kind that didn't need to be filled. A gentle wind moved through the birch trees beyond the barn, the leaves whispering like old friends saying goodbye. Years later, people would still tell their story around fires, in letters, in the hush before sleep. Some would change the details, as stories often go, but the heart of it stayed true. That once, in silver, hollow, A cowboy had seen a girl cry when the world turned its back on her, and instead of walking away, he'd taken her hand and said, "Dance with me." Out on the porch. Long after the lamps had gone out, Jonas looked at the stars and thought of all the miles he'd ridden to end up right here home, at last. He breathed deep, slow, letting the night fill him. There was no need for words. The land spoke enough. The wind carried the rest. And in that quiet, the legend of Silver Hollow lived on, not in marble or ink, but in the hearts of those who believed that sometimes the smallest kindness can outlast a lifetime. A soft pause, a flicker of lamplight, then only the sound of the wind moving through the grass, whispering the same old truth, love, when it's real, never really ends. Sometimes life doesn't turn on grand victories, but on quiet choices, the ones made when no one is watching. He saw her crying in front of everyone isn't just a story about love, it's about dignity, kindness, and the courage to reach out when it would be easier to walk away. In the dust and silence of Silver Hollow, two people found that healing doesn't come from forgetting pain, but from sharing it gently, patiently, without judgment. Jonas didn't rescue Clara with words or promises. He simply stayed, offering respect where others offered pity. And from that simple act, a life took root. As we grow older, we come to see that kindness costs little, but means everything. Pride fades, strength softens, and what remains, what truly endures, is the grace we give to one another. So perhaps the lesson is this: even when the world turns cold, don't turn away. Sometimes, the smallest gesture, an open hand, a steady presence, a quiet dance can mend what years have broken, and that, more than anything, is what keeps the heart young. Thank you for staying with us through the story of Silver Hollow. If this journey into the heart of the Old West touched you, we'd be grateful if you'd like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. One whisper, one dance, one memory at a time.